The dust of Redemption Creek settled on everything, a fine ochre shroud over shame and commerce alike. It coated the sweat-slicked hats of the townsmen, the bonnets of their tight-lipped wives, and the raw timber of the auction block that stood in the town square like a profane altar. Heat radiated in shimmering waves from the parched earth, making the air thick and hard to draw. For Silas Garrett, the heat was a familiar purgatory. He stood apart from the crowd, his tall frame a rigid silhouette against the glare, a man carved from the same granite as the distant, unforgiving mountains that bordered his land. At 45, wealth had insulated him from want, but not from memory. His black coat, too heavy for the season, was an armor of formality. His face, a mask of stony indifference that had taken 5 years to perfect. He was a monument to loss, and he had made his sprawling, empty ranch into a mausoleum for his heart. The auctioneer, a man whose jollity was as false as a lead dollar, bellowed out prices for livestock and foreclosed land. The crowd murmured, a beast with a single greedy stomach. Then the tone shifted. A hush fell, thick with a prurient, ugly anticipation. They brought the woman out first, her back a roadmap of scars, her eyes fixed on a point beyond the horizon of her misery. She was sold quickly, for a pittance, to a farmer who looked at her teeth before he looked at her face. Then came the reason for the hush. A man carried a small bundle, a wailing scrap of humanity, wrapped in rough burlap. The infant, Samuel, though no one here would ever grant him a name. He was listed on the manifest as male child, healthy, 6 weeks. Property. A collective sigh rippled through the onlookers. A few women clutched their own children closer, a gesture less of empathy than of possessive fear. Silas's hands, hidden in his coat pockets, clenched into fists, the knuckles white. The baby's cry sliced through the thick air, a thin, reedy wail of pure, helpless need. It was a sound he knew. It was the sound of midnight fevers and scraped knees, the sound of a small hand reaching for his in the dark. It was the cry of his Lily, the memory, a ghost he kept chained in the deepest dungeon of his mind, rattled its restraints. 5 years. 5 years since the fever had stolen first his daughter, Lily, and then, in a slow, silent drowning of sorrow, his wife, Sarah. The world had ended for him then, and he had simply forgotten to die. He had built a fortress of solitude on his ranch instead, a vast, silent testament to all he had lost, its empty rooms echoing with a silence more deafening than any scream. "Do I have an opening bid for this prime article?" The auctioneer boomed, holding the infant up as if it were a prize ham. "A strong back for the fields in 15 years, a lifetime of labor for a piddling price today." The baby's wail intensified, a desperate, frantic sound that vibrated in Silas's teeth. He saw Lily's face, round and flushed with the sickness, her tiny chest struggling for air. "Daddy, it hurts." The world tilted, the dust and the sun-bleached faces of the crowd blurring into a nauseating smear. He had to get out. He had to get away from that sound. All eyes, however, seemed to turn to him. Silas Garrett, the richest man in 3 counties, a man who owned 1,000 acres of prime grazing land and a house with 10 empty bedrooms. They expected a gesture, a performance of charity that would absolve them all. Let the lonely, broken rancher buy the orphan. It would be a fine story to tell over Sunday dinner. He could feel their collective gaze as a physical pressure, a demand. They saw his wealth, his power. They couldn't see the gaping, cauterized wound he lived with every second of every day. To care again, to let another small, fragile life into his world, would be to invite the agony back in. It would be like setting a match to his own heart. He would not. He could not. A man stepped forward, his boots polished to a high sheen despite the dust. Marcus Webb. His wealth was newer than Silas's, built on cotton and the flesh that picked it. Webb's smile was a thin, cruel slash in his face, a look of reptilian satisfaction. He owned the plantation that bordered the freedmen's settlement, a constant, menacing presence. $20, Webb said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. He wasn't looking at the baby. He was looking at the crowd, at the freed slaves who stood at the edge of the square, their faces masks of anguish. He was buying not a future laborer, but a symbol of their powerlessness. The auctioneer's eyes darted to Silas. $20 from Mr. Webb, a fine start. Do I hear 30? Mr. Garrett, a fine addition to any household. Silas did not move. He kept his eyes fixed on the distant mountains, the granite peaks that promised nothing but stone and silence. He let the auctioneer's plea hang in the air, unanswered. The baby's cries were a physical assault now, each one a nail driven deeper into the coffin of his past. Don't look, don't listen. It's not Lily. It will never be Lily again. He had chosen his path. Numbness was survival. The cost of feeling was a price he was no longer willing to pay. $20 going once. A tremor of shock went through the crowd, not of outrage but of surprise. Silas Garrett, who could buy the entire town and not notice the expense, was letting this happen. His refusal was not just a personal choice, it was a disruption of the expected order, a crack in the fragile veneer of civility they all pretended to uphold. Going twice. Webb's smile widened. He had won more than an infant. He had won a public victory, asserted his dominance. Sold! The auctioneer cried, his hammer falling with a crack that sounded like a breaking bone. To Mr. Marcus Webb for $20. Webb's man stepped forward to collect the property. The baby's mother, held back by two men, let out a sound that was not human, a howl of primal despair that would haunt the dreams of any man who still had a soul. Silas turned, his movements stiff, and walked away. He did not run. He walked with the measured, deliberate pace of a man leaving a gravesite. The murmur of the crowd followed him, but the sound that pursued him, the sound that echoed off the false fronts of the saloons and the dry goods store, was the ghost of his daughter's cry, now mingled with the fresh, raw agony of another's loss. He had chosen the cold safety of his fortress, but as he mounted his horse, he felt a tremor in the foundations of his world, a crack in the stone he'd so carefully built around his heart. The silence he was riding toward suddenly felt less like peace and more like a tomb. The ride back to the Garrett Ranch was a journey through a landscape that mirrored his own soul, vast, beautiful, and profoundly empty. Cottonwoods lined the creek bed, their leaves whispering in the dry breeze, but their shade offered no comfort. The sun beat down on the golden grasses of his pastures, where his cattle grazed, oblivious dots of life in an ocean of solitude. He rode past the small, weathered cross on a low hill, the one that marked where Sarah and Lily lay. He didn't stop. He hadn't stopped in years. To stop was to remember, and to remember was to burn. His house rose from the plains like a great, hollow monument. 2 stories of fine timber and broad glass windows, a porch that wrapped around it like an empty embrace. It was a house built for laughter, for the patter of small feet, for the warmth of a family. Now, it was just a shell. He dismounted, the crunch of his boots on the gravel the only sound. Inside, the air was still and cool. Dust motes danced in the shafts of late afternoon light slanting through the tall windows of the great room. The furniture, expensive and barely used, stood like shrouded figures in a forgotten ballroom. The silence pressed in on him, a physical weight. This was the peace he had paid for, the quiet he had killed a part of himself to achieve. So why did it feel like he was suffocating? He went to the sideboard and poured a whiskey, the amber liquid a familiar fire in his throat. He drank it standing, staring at the portrait over the grand stone fireplace. Sarah and Lily, painted a year before the fever. Sarah's smile was gentle, her eyes full of a light that had once been his whole world. Lily was on her lap, a chubby-cheeked toddler with a mischievous grin, her hand reaching for the artist's brush. His hand trembled, the glass rattling against his teeth. The infant's cry was still in his ears, and phantom echo, "You did nothing." The voice was his own, cold and unforgiving. "You stood there like a stone and let it happen." He poured another drink. What could he have done? Bought the child? And then what? Bring it here, to this house of ghosts? Let its cries fill these empty halls, a constant, torturous reminder of the cries he could no longer hear? It was impossible. It was a form of self-immolation he could not endure. He was a stone, he had to be. Stones don't feel. Stones don't break. He was on his third whiskey when he saw them. A flicker of movement on the horizon, at the far edge of his property where the road met his land. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a heat shimmer, but the shape grew, resolved itself. Riders. A long, slow-moving column of them. His first instinct was the rancher's primal fear. Rustlers, bandits. He moved to the gun rack by the door, his hand closing around the cool, smooth stock of a Winchester. But as they drew closer, he saw they carried no banners, made no charge. They rode with a solemn, deliberate pace, their formation less like a raiding party and more like a funeral procession. He recognized the leader at once. Dina Ross. She rode a sway-backed mule, her posture as straight and unyielding as a church steeple. Behind her in twos and threes came the others, the 50 men and women who had bought their freedom, or been granted it, now living on the hard-scrabble patch of land Webb's plantation, choked on 3 sides. They were the ones he had seen at the edge of the auction square, their faces a collective mask of quiet fury. He watched them approach, his heart a cold, heavy knot in his chest. They were coming for him. He stepped out onto the porch, leaving the rifle behind. It was not a battle they sought. He knew that. This was something else. He stood at the top of the steps as they reached the ornate iron gate that marked the entrance to his yard, the gate that had remained closed to visitors for 5 years. They didn't try to open it. They didn't shout. They simply stopped. A silent, dusty congregation, their horses and mules breathing heavily in the quiet air. 50 pairs of eyes, all fixed on him. They were a jury, and his pristine, empty house was the evidence of his crime. Their silence was a more profound accusation than any curse. It spoke of shared loss, of communal grief, of a world of pain he had walled himself off from, believing his own was unique. After a long moment that stretched into an eternity, Dina Ross dismounted. She moved with a purpose that was weary but unbreakable. She walked to the gate, her hands resting on the cold iron bars. She was not a large woman, but she possessed a gravity that seemed to pull the world in around her. Her face was etched with lines of hardship, but her eyes were clear and sharp, and they saw right through the fortress of his solitude. "Mr. Garrett," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried across the yard with perfect clarity, cutting through the silence he had so carefully curated. It was not a plea, it was a statement. He did not answer, merely inclined his head. "We saw you in town," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "We all saw you." "I have business in town," he said, his own voice sounding rusty and strange in his ears. "You had a choice," she said, ignoring his deflection. The other riders remained mounted, silent witnesses. "You had the means. You could have saved that child." "It's not my child," he bit out, the words tasting like ash. "It's not my concern." A flicker of something, pity perhaps, or a deep, knowing sorrow crossed her face. "You think your grief gives you the right to be a ghost among the living?" she asked, her voice softening, but with an edge like honed steel. "You think because you lost your own, you owe nothing to anyone else's?" The word struck him with the force of a physical blow. He flinched, the stone mask cracking for an instant. How could she know? "We all have ghosts, Mr. Garrett," she went on, her eyes boring into his. "I had a son. His name was Isaac. He was 7 when he was sold south. I never saw him again. Every day I see his face. Every night I hear him calling for me. Does my grief give me the right to turn my back when another mother's child is stolen? Does it absolve me?" She gestured back at the silent company behind her. "Ask any one of them. They all carry a grave inside them. The difference is some of us are still trying to save the living." His armor, so carefully constructed, was not just pierced, it was shattered. She had seen the specific shape of his pain and named it, not as an excuse, but as a failed responsibility. He looked past her, at the faces of the others. He saw their shared trauma, not as a weakness, but as the source of their collective strength, the very thing that bound them together. And he, in his grand house, with his boundless land and his bottomless grief, had never been more alone. The walls of his solitude, which he had mistaken for a fortress, were a cage. The silence was not peace. It was the sound of his own soul slowly dying. He looked from their determined, weary faces to the imposing, dead silence of his house, and for the first time in 5 years, he felt a profound and terrifying shame. The choice he had made in the town square was not one of self-preservation. It was an act of cowardice. The setting sun cast long, dramatic shadows across the yard, painting the silent company in hues of blood and gold. Silas looked at Dina's face, at the unshakable certainty in her eyes, and felt the foundations of his world give way. The grief he had nurtured like a rare poisonous flower was no longer a shield. It was an anchor, drowning him in a sea of his own making. Dina did not press him further. She simply stood there, her presence a challenge, an invitation out of the tomb he had built for himself. He turned without a word and walked to the gate. The iron was cool beneath his hand as he worked the heavy, rusted latch. The screech it made as he pulled it open was the sound of a seal being broken, a long closed door groaning into the light. He opened it wide and stepped back. "Come in," he said, the words feeling foreign and momentous. Dina gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. She led her mule through the gate, and the others followed, a slow, solemn procession into the heart of his solitude. They dismounted in the yard, their movements quiet and deliberate, as if entering a church. They filled the empty space with their presence, a tide of weary, determined humanity washing into the sterile emptiness he had called home. He led them into the house, into the cavernous great room. They entered with a quiet reverence, their worn clothes and dusty boots a stark contrast to the polished floors and brocaded furniture. They stood in a loose circle around the cold stone hearth, their eyes taking in the trappings of a life so different from their own. The silence was no longer empty. It was charged, filled with unspoken questions and the palpable weight of their mission. Silas felt like a stranger in his own home. These people, with their shared history of bondage and loss, had a bond he could only envy. They were a community forged in fire, while he was an island, cold and alone. Dina finally broke the silence. "Marcus Webb has the child," she stated, her voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room. "He took him to his plantation. Webb's place is a fortress. He has armed guards. A direct assault would be a slaughter. Our slaughter." "Then what do you want from me?" Silas asked, his voice rough. "My money? Is that it?" He gestured around the opulent room. "Take it. It's done me no good." "We don't want your charity, Mr. Garrett," Dina said, her tone sharp. "Charity is what you hand down from a height to make yourself feel better. We are not beneath you. We are asking you to stand with us. Your money is a tool, yes, but we need your mind. You're a strategist. You built this," she swept her hand, indicating the ranch, the empire of land, not just with sweat, but with wits. You know how men like Webb think. You know their weaknesses. He looked at their faces one by one. He saw desperation, yes, but beneath it, a bedrock of resolve. He saw the woman who had cried out at the auction, her face now a mask of stoic grief, her eyes fixed on him with a terrible, pleading hope. He saw an old man with hands gnarled from a lifetime of labor, his back straight with a dignity that had never been broken. He saw them all, and in their collective gaze, he saw the ghost of his own failure. The wail of the infant in the town square was no longer just an echo of his past. It was a demand on his future. To refuse now would be the final death of the man he once was, the man Sarah had loved. It was a terrifying choice. To step out of the grave he had so carefully dug for himself was to risk feeling again. The pain was a sleeping dragon, and he was about to wake it. But the alternative, to send them away, to close the gate and retreat back into his silent, gilded cage, was suddenly unbearable. It was the difference between a scar and a festering wound. He walked to the large oak table that sat unused in the center of the room. He ran a hand over its dusty surface. "Violence won't work," he said, his voice quiet but firm, taking on a new timbre of command. The room grew still, every eye on him. Webb expects it. He thrives on it. It proves to him that he is stronger. We don't fight him on his terms, we fight him on ours. He looked up, his gaze sweeping across the assembled faces. For the first time in 5 years, his eyes were not clouded by the fog of memory, but were sharp, focused, alive with a cold, clear purpose. He's insulated by fear and by money, so we take both away from him. We don't attack his fortress of timber and stone. We dismantle his fortress of influence and wealth. We turn the town against him, not with force, but with whispers, with truth, with panic. He began to pace, the familiar energy of a commander taking hold of him, an energy he thought had died with his family. Webb has loans. He has partners. He has buyers for his cotton who value their reputations in faraway cities. He thinks his cruelty is his strength, but it's his greatest vulnerability. We will make his name synonymous with barbarism, not just here, but everywhere his money reaches. We will make it more expensive for people to do business with him than to cut him loose. He stopped and looked at Dina. You and your people are not just victims. You are a network. You hear things. You see things. You know who delivers his goods, who banks his money, who drinks with him at the saloon. You will be my eyes and my ears. He turned to the others. We will create a story of a man so depraved he deals in the flesh of infants while his crops rot from a blight that doesn't exist. We'll start a rumor about his finances, a seed of doubt that will grow into a run on his credit. We will use his own greed against him. We will isolate him, squeeze him, and when he is alone and choking, then I will go and see him, and I will get the boy. A murmur went through the room, not of confusion, but of dawning understanding. He was not offering them a heroic charge. He was giving them a strategy, a plan that turned their perceived weakness into a formidable weapon. He was taking command, not with the bravado of a gunslinger, but with the quiet, chilling competence of a man who understood the mechanics of power. This was not a man drowning in grief. This was a leader. Reluctantly, terrifyingly, Silas Garrett was stepping out of the grave. He looked at the faces watching him, their expressions shifting from desperation to a fragile, nascent hope, and he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in half a decade. Purpose. It was a cold and dangerous feeling, but it was infinitely better than the crushing weight of nothing at all. The Garrett Ranch, for 5 years, a silent monument to death, became a hive of quiet, purposeful activity. The plan Silas had laid out was a complex tapestry, and the 50 freedmen and women became the weavers, their threads of information and influence reaching into every corner of the county. They moved not as a mob, but as a quiet, insidious current, a force of nature Webb would never see coming. An old man who swept the floors at the bank overheard conversations about Webb's outstanding loans. A woman who did laundry for the hotelier's wife learned of a planned visit from a cotton buyer from New Orleans. A young man who worked the livery stables knew which of Webb's associates were in town and where they were drinking. Each piece of information, seemingly small on its own, was brought back to the great room of Silas's house, where it was laid on the great oak table, like a piece of a puzzle. Silas, in turn, unleashed his own power. He sent telegrams to business contacts in St. Louis and Memphis, men who owed him favors, men who controlled lines of credit and shipping routes. He didn't issue threats. He posed questions. Have you heard about the stability of Webb's operation? There's talk of disease in his fields. I'm reconsidering my own investments in the region, given the moral volatility. A man who'd buy a baby at auction might cut corners elsewhere. He planted seeds of doubt in the fertile ground of other men's greed. He wrote a carefully worded anonymous letter to the New Orleans cotton buyer, detailing a fictional but plausible blight, and paid a rider to ensure it arrived a day before the buyer was set to travel. The effect was not immediate, but it was inexorable. It was like watching water seep into the foundations of a house. A small creditor, spooked by a rumor, called in a minor loan. Webb paid it, annoyed. Then, a larger business partner, having received a concerned telegram from his own banker in St. Louis, pulled out of a deal. The cotton buyer from New Orleans postponed his trip indefinitely, citing market instability. The whispers in the saloon grew louder. Webb, secure in his fortress, at first dismissed it. But the whispers turned into conversations, and the conversations turned into closed doors. The town that had watched him with fear and deference now looked at him with a new expression. Calculation. His perceived power was a currency, and its value was plummeting. Dina was the conductor of this silent orchestra. She moved between her community and Silas's house, her presence a steadying force. She saw the change in Silas. The haunted, stony look in his eyes was being replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. He ate with them, sharing the simple meals they cooked in his cavernous, unused kitchen. He listened to their stories, not as a distant benefactor, but as a comrade. The ghosts of Sarah and Lily were still there. He could feel their presence in the quiet moments, but they were no longer chains holding him down. They were a fire at his back, propelling him forward. The act of doing, of fighting for this one small life, was a more potent antidote to his grief than 1,000 bottles of whiskey had ever been. After 2 weeks, the trap was set. Webb was bleeding money, and more importantly, influence. He was becoming isolated, his cruelty no longer a sign of his power, but a liability. It was time. "I'll ride out at dawn," Silas announced one evening, standing before the fire that now blazed in the great hearth every night, a beacon of life in the once dead house. Dina nodded. "We'll be ready." "No," Silas said firmly. "You will not. You will stay here, all of you. This is not a battle, it's a negotiation. If I ride in with an army at my back, he'll feel cornered. A cornered rat is the most dangerous kind. I have to go alone." A murmur of protest rose from the room. "He'll kill you," one of the men said. "He won't," Silas replied, his voice calm and certain. "Killing me solves nothing for him now. It would only confirm every rumor and turn the entire county against him for good. His power is gone. He just doesn't fully realize it yet. My visit will be the final proof." He looked at Dina. "This is the one part of the plan I have to do myself." Dina studied his face for a long moment, seeing the iron resolve there. She knew he was right. She also knew the immense risk he was taking. "What is your offer?" she asked. "I'll offer to buy the boy," Silas said, "for an obscene amount of money, enough to solve the financial problems we've created for him." "And if he refuses?" Silas's eyes grew cold. "Then he will reveal to me what I already suspect, that this was never about money. It was about power, and I will show him that he has none left." The next morning, under a sky the color of slate, Silas rode out alone. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of rain. He was not the same man who had ridden from town 2 weeks earlier. The black coat of mourning was gone, replaced by the practical, durable clothing of a rancher. He felt the fear, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was a clean fear, the fear of a soldier entering a battlefield, not the murky, self-destructive terror of a man haunted by ghosts. As he rode, he thought of the infant. He did not yet have a face in his mind, only a cry that had cracked his world open and against all odds, let the light back in. Webb's plantation was a scar on the land. The fields were vast, the cotton plants stretching to the horizon, but the outbuildings were squalid, and the main house was an ostentatious monstrosity of white columns and dark windows, a temple to a cruel god. Armed guards watched from the porch as Silas approached, their expressions a mixture of suspicion and surprise at seeing a lone rider. He dismounted and walked toward the house, his steps even and unhurried. He was walking into the spider's web, but he was the one who had weakened its threads. One of the guards blocked his path. "Mr. Webb ain't seeing visitors." Tell him Silas Garrett is here to make him a rich man, Silas said, his voice level. He'll see me. He was made to wait on the porch, a calculated display of power. But Silas was patient. He stood looking out over the fields, seeing not their productivity, but the human cost that watered them. Finally, the door opened. He was led into Webb's study. The room was suffocatingly opulent, all dark wood, red velvet, and the smell of cigar smoke and brandy. Marcus Webb sat behind a massive desk, a small, malevolent king on a mahogany throne. He did not rise. Garrett, Webb said, his lips curling into a semblance of a smile. To what do I owe the displeasure? Come to beg for a loan. I hear things aren't what they used to be for some folks. He was trying to project confidence, but Silas could see the strain in his eyes, the tightness around his mouth. The rumors had found their mark. I've come to make you an offer, Webb, Silas said, ignoring the jibe. He remained standing, choosing not to sit in the chair Webb indicated. He would not be comfortable in this house. I want the boy. Webb laughed, a dry, humorless sound. The little article from the auction? I'd forgotten about him. He's mine. Property. Why the sudden interest? Your conscience finally get the better of you? Let's dispense with the theater, Silas said, his voice dropping, becoming as cold and hard as Riverstone. You're in trouble. Your credit is stretched thin, your partners are backing away, and that buyer from New Orleans isn't coming. You're bleeding, and you're trying to pretend it's just a scratch. Webb's smile faltered. The blood drained from his face, leaving it pasty. You, he stammered, realization dawning. This was you. I want the boy, Silas repeated, and in exchange I will give you $5,000, in cash, enough to quiet your creditors and stop the bleeding. The sum was astronomical, a fortune. For a moment, naked, desperate greed warred with pride in Webb's eyes. He licked his lips. $5,000 could fix everything. But then, his gaze hardened. He looked at Silas, at the man who had outmaneuvered him, who had dismantled his empire of fear with whispers, and his hatred overrode his greed. This was no longer about a financial transaction. It was about dominance. It was about who held the power. No, Webb snarled, leaning forward. No! You think you can come in here and dictate terms to me? You think you can ruin me and then buy your conscience clean for a few dollars? He stood up, his face contorted with rage. That boy is mine. He is a symbol. He is a lesson to every slave and freedman in this county that I am the one in charge. Selling him to you would be admitting defeat. I would rather burn this entire plantation to the ground with him in it than sell him to you. He had said it. He had laid his depraved, blackened soul bare. It was never about the child's value as property. It was about the commodification of hope, the ownership of another's future. It was pure systemic evil, given a face and a name. Silas felt not rage, but a profound, clarifying calm. I thought you might say that, he said softly. And then, a sound began. It was faint at first, a low hum on the edge of hearing, like distant thunder. Webb frowned, distracted. What is that? The sound grew, a rhythmic deep pounding that seemed to come from the very earth itself, the sound of hundreds of horses' hooves. Webb rushed to the window, his face a mask of confusion and dawning horror. Silas followed and stood beside him. On the low hills that surrounded the plantation, on every rise and every ridge they appeared. Riders. They crested the hills not in a rush, but in a slow, inexorable wave. First dozens, then 100, then more. It was not just Dina's 50, it was an army. Small ranchers whose land Webb had threatened, sharecroppers he had cheated, townsfolk who had been cowed into silence and had finally found their voice. They were black and white, men and women, an army of conscience brought together by a single shared purpose. They carried no rifles, no banners. They simply sat upon their horses, a silent, unbreachable wall of judgment, their collective gaze fixed upon the house. Webb stumbled back from the window, his breath coming in ragged gasps. What is this? What have you done? I did nothing, Silas said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of all the riders on the hills. "This is what you have done, Webb. This is the harvest of the seeds you've sown. Your guards have already laid down their guns. Your fortress of fear is gone. You are alone." As if on cue, the ornate front gate of the plantation swung open. Dina Ross walked through it. She did not look at the main house, at the window where Webb stood, shattered and defeated. She walked with a calm, righteous purpose toward one of the small outbuildings, the one where the domestic slaves were kept. She disappeared inside. Webb stared, his empire of cruelty dismantled not by a bullet or a blade, but by the collective will of the people he had terrorized. His power was an illusion, and the illusion had been torn away. He turned to Silas, his face a ruin of disbelief and hatred. "You will not get away with this." Silas looked at the broken man before him. "It's already done." A moment later, Dina emerged from the cabin. In her arms, she carried a small, swaddled bundle. She held the infant close, her head bowed over him in a gesture of profound reverence and protection. The rescue was not a battle. It was a sacred act of reclamation. Dina walked back through the gate, and two of the riders moved to flank her, forming a guard of honor. Silas gave Webb one last look, a look that held no triumph, only a grim finality. Then he turned and walked out of the house, leaving Marcus Webb alone in the opulent, suffocating room, a king of a crumbling, empty kingdom, besieged by the ghosts of his own sins. The journey back was not a victory parade. It was a quiet, solemn procession under a sky that had begun to weep a soft, cleansing rain. The great army of conscience dispersed as it had formed, melting back into the landscape, the riders peeling off in small groups toward their own homes and farms, their duty done. The only sound was the gentle splash of hooves on the muddy track and the soft murmur of the rain. Silas rode beside Dina, who held the sleeping infant nestled against her chest, shielded from the elements. Silas couldn't take his eyes off the small bundle. He felt a strange and powerful pull, a mix of terror and a fragile, unfamiliar hope. They arrived back at the ranch as dusk was falling. The house, which had once been a beacon of his isolation, was now a sanctuary of light. Every window glowed with the warm, yellow light of lamps and fire. The front door stood open, an invitation. As they dismounted, people came out onto the porch, their faces anxious, then breaking into expressions of profound, silent relief as they saw the baby, safe in Dina's arms. Inside, the great room was warm and filled with the smell of wood smoke and baking bread. The space that had once echoed with emptiness was now vibrant with the quiet hum of life. Children who had been sleeping on pallets woke and stared with wide, curious eyes. Adults moved with a sense of shared ownership, of belonging. This was their victory, and this house was its symbol. Dina walked to the hearth, where the fire blazed, and gently adjusted the infant's wrappings. She looked up at Silas, a question in her eyes. With a hesitant step, he moved toward her. He felt the gaze of everyone in the room on him, but it was not the demanding, expectant gaze of the crowd in the town square. This was the look of family, of a community waiting for one of its own. Dina held the baby out to him. "He needs a name," she said softly. Silas's hands trembled as he reached out. He had not held a child in 5 years. The weight was at once shockingly small and immeasurably heavy. It was a weight of responsibility, of future, of life itself. He looked down at the infant's face for the first time. The baby's eyes were open, dark and deep and startlingly aware. He was not crying. He simply watched Silas with a serene, trusting calm. In that small, perfect face, Silas did not see the ghost of his daughter. The phantom pain that had haunted him, the specter of Lily, was finally at peace. He saw only this child, a new soul, a new beginning, a promise. He felt the tight, frozen knot of grief in his chest, the one he had carried for so long, finally, gently, begin to dissolve. It was not gone, but it no longer defined him. It was a scar, a part of his story, but not the entire book. He looked from the child's face to Dina's. and then to the faces of the others gathered around the fire. He saw their shared strength, their resilience, their grace. He saw the family he had never known he needed. "His name," Silas said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer name, "is Samuel. God has heard." A quiet understanding passed through the room. It was more than a name. It was an acknowledgement, a prayer, a covenant. It was the final, definitive step out of his tomb and into the light. Later that night, long after the house had settled into a soft rhythm of sleep, Silas stood on the porch. The rain had stopped, and the air was clean and cool. The moon broke through the clouds, bathing the land he owned in a gentle silver light. For years, he had looked out at this vista and seen only emptiness, a reflection of the hollow space within him. Tonight, he saw something different. He saw a refuge, he saw a home. The house behind him was no longer a mausoleum. It was alive. It was filled with the soft sounds of breathing, with the warmth of shared lives, with the quiet but unshakable promise of a new day. He was no longer Silas Garrett, the haunted, isolated rancher. He was a man standing watch over his family. A profound, hard-earned peace settled over him, a peace that was not about forgetting what he had lost, but about honoring it by building a future for others. The fortress of his grief had fallen, and in its place a home, built one splinter and one scar at a time, had finally begun to rise.